For our second evolution lesson, we're going to look again at Lamarckism and what his ideas were, and we'll do a little bit more detail on Darwinism. Then we're going to look at the more modern ideas of how evolution occurs, and that's going to be punctuated equilibrium. And we'll start looking at speciation, but I'm not sure how far we'll get. So let's have a look at Lamarckism to recap. So just a reminder, Lamarck was not correct at all, so nothing about his ideas are considered law today. That's why we talk about him having two laws in inverted commas, so they're not technical laws anymore, they've been disproved. So Lamarck's two laws were based on what he saw, and his ideas were that when something uses a part of their body a lot, it'll get bigger, and if that body part is not used a lot, it'll get smaller. So we call that the law of use and disuse. So if there's use, the object gets bigger. If there's disuse, that object will get smaller. Now the next very important thing is the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So that means that any modifications that you acquired during your lifetime will be passed on to the offspring when reproduction takes place. So remember, the examples I give are, if you had piercings done, then that means your babies will be born with piercings, because that was something you acquired on your body. And there was that will to do it yourself. So there was that will that you had to get the piercing, and so you willed yourself to change, and then that change will be passed on to offspring, which we know is not true. Otherwise we'd be born like patchworks of people. So this is the general idea. Organisms pass on traits that they acquire during their life to their offspring, and they acquire those traits either by using a body part a lot, if there's use, or not using a body part a lot, and then there is disuse. So the example we give is the giraffe example. That's the very typical Lamarck example, because that's just got to do with how giraffes got their long necks. So what he thought was, there were some giraffes that did not use their necks a lot. Let's zoom in on this picture rather. So there were some giraffes that did not use their necks a lot. They were eating the short bushes, so their necks stayed a nice small size. Then there were some giraffes that were stretching their necks to reach these top branches of a tree. And the more they stretched their necks, the longer that they grew. So it's important to note, this giraffe is the same as this one, meaning this was maybe when it was 1 year old, and this is when it's 5 years old, for example. So one organism can show change, and then this organism did not use its neck a lot, so it's not shown here, but would assume it grew smaller according to Lamarck's laws. Then this giraffe, if it has a baby, it will pass on its long neck to its offspring. So here is mother, child, for example, whereas this is young mother, older mother. So that's the same species giraffe. So the change occurs in an individual of the species, whereas Darwin, the whole species changes all at once. So over time, these giraffes would die out because the bushes that are at a low level, there's too much competition with other herbivores or other short-necked giraffes, and they would all die out over time, and only the long-necked giraffes can get food, so they would survive. So when you're looking at actually writing an example according to Lamarckism, you always want to identify where was their use. So if I asked you to explain why giraffes have a long neck, you would say that they use their necks a lot, so they grew longer. So you're identifying that there was a lot of use of the neck. And then the next thing you want to always say is that the long necks that were acquired were passed on to the next generation. So there's some form of inheritance. It's always a two-part answer. Okay, Darwinism on the other hand, I'll just recap briefly and then we'll do one more Lamarck idea. He proposed this idea of evolution through natural selection. So natural selection is when nature decides what traits are beneficial for the environment. And now we say decides in inverted commas because nature is not able to form those thoughts. Darwinism can also be called gradualism or phyletic gradualism, which we'll look at a little bit later. But what it is it's slow changes in a species over long periods of time. So it's important that you know that it's in a species, not in an individual. So it's not like just me changing slightly by using a part of my body a lot or by not using it. It would be over the entire human species or the entire giraffe species. So there were these ideas. He always says there's variation in a species, and there is. If you look around at your classmates, there's a huge amount of variation in just the human species. In nature, in a natural environment, there are more offspring produced than can survive. Yes, it's one of the things that make us cry in David Attenborough movies, but it's true. And there is always some competition for resources. Now, remember, when we're looking at an example of Darwin, it's not always competition that leads to the animals dying or not dying. It could be any other kind of selective pressure. Like, it's not whether some animals got food and the other ones didn't because they just weren't as fast or whatever. It might be that some were camouflaged so could escape predation. So don't always just put there's competition for resources if the question is asking you about some mice got eaten and the others didn't. It's got nothing to do with competition that's causing some to die and some to live. That has to do with predation. And then the last thing is always saying that the organisms that survive will reproduce. Always put both those terms together, and they pass their beneficial genes onto the offspring. So if we look at the giraffe example by Darwin, you always start off, your first sentence is always, there is variation in a species or population of whatever we're talking about. Here we talk about giraffes. So there is variation in the population of giraffes. Now you introduce the variation. Don't take shortcuts here. Some had long necks, some had short necks. That is the variation. If we're talking about eyelashes of giraffes, then we would say some had curly eyelashes, some had straight eyelashes. But you always, that's often two ticks. So it would be a tick for there is variation in the population of giraffes, or you could say variation in the neck sizes. That's another more specific thing. In the neck sizes in the population of giraffes, some had long necks, some had short necks. But here you can see that I'm speaking about necks in the second part of my answer. So this mark here is not necessarily essential. If you said there was variation in neck sizes in the population of giraffes, some were long, some were short, that's also fine because you said neck sizes or neck length. Okay, there are more offspring produced than can survive, yes. Here the selective pressure is competition. Nature is deciding through limited food sources which animals are going to survive and which ones are not. So there was competition for food. Those with short necks couldn't reach food on the higher branches. So they starved and died. Try and make that link. Don't just stop with they can't reach the food because they might move away. Technically, they can go somewhere else and eat and find food. So you want to say that they starved and died. I know it's harsh, but it's true. Those with long necks could reach the food on the higher branches. Therefore, again, they survived and reproduced. Now, this must follow on. This next bullet point must follow on perfectly. Therefore, the genes for long necks were passed on to the next generation. So the long necks will reproduce more because they're getting more food. They're not so weak as the short-necked giraffes. I just want to go over this question on Lamarckism, just to give us an idea before we move on fully with Darwinism. So you had to do this last week. Using Lamarck's laws, explain why gorillas have big teeth while humans have small teeth. So there's a two-part section to this answer. So you want to identify, was there use or was there disuse? So gorillas have big teeth. That means their teeth were used a lot. Humans have small teeth. That implies disuse. So I'm actually going to write that in there. That is disuse, while gorillas is use of their teeth. Now you want to assume, why did they use their teeth a lot, these gorillas, and why did humans not need to use their teeth a lot? And there's one big difference. So gorillas were eating food that required lots of chewing, or you can say tough or fibrous food. Very likely also raw food. Raw food does require a lot more chewing. It's like, think of chewing raw broccoli versus cooked, soft, squishy broccoli. Okay, so we're identifying that there was a lot of chewing, which is using your teeth a lot. So they used their teeth a lot. That means their teeth grew bigger. So there's use, so something got bigger. The large teeth that were acquired, there's a compulsory mark, were passed on to the offspring. Okay, that's easy. Humans ate soft or cooked food. So there's going to be disuse. They did not use their teeth a lot. So their teeth became smaller, and the smaller teeth that they acquired were passed on to their offspring. So again, it's just simply making sure you're identifying where was there some use so something got bigger, where was there disuse so something got smaller, and then you talk about the traits that were acquired, were passed on to offspring. And try not to just use the word traits there instead of large teeth. So you don't want to say the traits were passed on to the offspring, because you want to be specific about what did they acquire in their lifetime. They acquired large teeth. Okay, there you would have a little 5-minute break just to refresh your brain a bit. So you can pause the video here. I'm going to carry on with looking at Darwinism. And the specific example that he used a lot was the example of the Galapagos finches. And what he noticed when he traveled on the Galapagos Islands was that there were these small birds either living on the ground or living in trees, or even in reeds like the warbler finch. So these are the ground finches, these are the tree finches. And he noticed that there were similarities between these birds that made him think that they were related, but enough difference in their beak size and shape that made him think that they were different. So he was trying to understand, how did these various different finch species, they're all different species, because there's a vegetarian finch, insectivorous finch, small insectivorous finch, woodpecker finch, etc. But they all shared a common ancestor at one point because they share so many similarities. So he based his ideas about natural selection on mainly the ground and tree finches, but also on the Galapagos tortoises, which we'll look at a little bit later. So the very well-known example is looking at this type of peppered moth. So this was observed in Manchester in the UK, and the first thing that we'll look at is this right-hand picture with the dark trees. So when the Industrial Revolution happened, factories were burning a huge amount of coal, and the coal smoke ended up covering these trees in like soot pretty much. And again, we always say there was variation in the moth population. Some were dark, some were light. So again, it's tick for saying that there was variation, tick for introducing the types of variation. I mean, that's 3 marks for one sentence. Then, because the trees became covered in soot, you can barely see this moth here. Some of you in the classroom probably won't even be able to see it if the board is not dark enough. But this is a moth's wings. So the black smoke caused the trees to be covered, which means the black moths were now camouflaged from predators. So if you were a predator, you're going to eat this moth. You can barely see this moth over here. So the white moths were eaten by the predators, and the black moths survived and reproduced, passing on their genes for dark wing color to their offspring. So in this picture, nature will select for the black moths. We say nature selects for or against. If nature selects for, it chooses the black moths based on the fact that they were luckily suited to the environment. Sorry for these guys. The important thing to note is that nature changes constantly. So when, after the Industrial Revolution, when the trees ended up being covered in lichen again, now you can see that the white moth or the pale moth is much more difficult to see and much more well camouflaged. So they were still in the population because the genes for white wing color don't just disappear overnight. But it meant that there would be more black moths when the trees were dark, more than the white moths, because they would have been eaten. But when the trees were clean again, the white moths were camouflaged and the black moths were easily seen and therefore eaten. Again, nothing about competition here. There's no competition for resources. This is about being eaten or not being eaten. So the white moths will survive and reproduce, passing on the genes for light color to their offspring. So nature selected for the white moths. So just to remind you, with Darwin, you always want to start off by saying, where was there variation? There was variation in the wings of the moths or whatever. Some were dark, some were light. Now you explain what was the selective pressure. What made some moths survive and the others not survive? So you say that the white moths were camouflaged, they weren't eaten, the black moths were eaten, sorry. And the white moth, therefore, you always say survived and reproduced, passing on the light-colored genes to their offspring. And nature selected for the white moths. The only thing that I'm missing in this answer, which is not always a mark in a memo, that's why I want you guys to focus on the science behind why did one variation survive and the other didn't, is because the one thing I'm missing, is more offspring are produced than can survive, which is sometimes a mark. But I don't want you to rely on it for a mark, because then you won't say enough about what caused some animals to die and others not. Another thing that Darwin looked at was something called vestigial organs, and we'll look at it in a little bit more detail in the next lesson. But for example, in snakes and in whales, you can see evidence of reduced hind limbs. So here in the whales there's a pelvis and a femur, which has become so small it doesn't really have a function. And the same in snakes. There's a vertebral column with a femur and a pelvis attached to it. So there are now small remnants or leftovers that don't have any function in that specific, like for example in the snake. But it does show that at one point they used to have legs, but the legs weren't beneficial in their environment. So over time, the animals that had smaller and smaller legs, in terms of the python and the whale, the animals that had the smaller legs had the more beneficial trait, and it's being bred out of the population over time, just like we have a tailbone. But like I said, we'll look at that in a little bit more detail when we do evidence for evolution. Okay, we can see evolution happening in present times. It's one of those things that you need to choose one example. So you could be asked, explain one example of modern day evolution. So you can read on page 209 and 210, but I will explain to you, I think this one is one of the easier ones, and the next one as well, XDR and MDR and TB. So we always start off with saying, well, the first thing is that development of resistance to insecticide in mosquitoes. The insecticide is called DDT. You don't have to know the name. It's just an insecticide that kills insects like mosquitoes. So mosquitoes show variation. Some are resistant to DDT, others are not. So if something is resistant to DDT, it's important for you to understand that resistance to DDT implies surviving. If something is not resistant, like if I am not resistant to a cold, I will die. If I am resistant, I will survive. So the ones that aren't resistant to DDT will die. So that means that they won't reproduce and pass on their genes for not being resistant to their offspring. Those that are resistant will survive because they won't be killed by the DDT. You can add that in there. And reproduce, passing on their genes for DDT resistance to their offspring. Then the DDT resistant mosquitoes reproduce very quickly because some of these guys died. So there's less competition for resources. If DDT is sprayed again, most of the mosquitoes will be resistant, because over a couple dozen generations, that resistance will become more and more prevalent in the population. And they will survive again, and the ones that weren't resistant, that were still in the population, will die. Which means that DDT can become very ineffective. And it's the same thing with antibiotic resistance, which is why you must always finish your antibiotic script. So we did this in grade 11. That's why I say it's an easy one to learn. There is variation in a population of TB bacteria. You must say there's variation in the bacteria. Some are resistant to antibiotics, some are not. It's something learners struggle with, where they talk about the bacteria, or the antibiotics, being resistant to the bacteria. Remember, only a living thing can be resistant, like bacteria. So bacteria are either resistant or not to antibiotics, meaning, and if you don't like the word resistant, stay away from it. Talk about some bacteria are killed by the antibiotic, some bacteria are not killed by the antibiotic, if you're struggling with this term resistant. But you must talk about the direction of resistance. It's not antibiotics are resistant to bacteria. Bacteria are resistant to antibiotics. So those that are not resistant will be killed by antibiotics. while those that are resistant will not be killed and will survive to reproduce rapidly. Again, you can see I always put survive and reproduce. Survive and reproduce. I don't put one term without the other, because the tick, if this was a paper, is on survive and reproduce. If you just write survive, you haven't got the mark. So if those ones that are resistant are not being killed and they survive and reproduce, the gene for antibiotic resistance will be passed on to the next generation or to the offspring. And over time, there'll be more bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics in each population. So these two for me make the most sense. Let's talk about resistance to either insecticides or to antibiotics over here. I find this one isn't explained well enough in your textbook, so I've tried to make it like slightly more clear, but you guys can choose. There's variation in the population of HI viruses. I put population in inverted commas because they're not living. So population is a group of species that live in a defined area at a certain time. And species are living organisms that look alike and can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Viruses aren't living, so they don't really fall into that bracket. So yeah, just to be aware. And it's the same thing. Some of the HI viruses are resistant to antiretrovirals, others are not. Those that are not resistant will be killed by antiretrovirals, while those that are resistant will not be killed by antiretrovirals. They will survive and reproduce rapidly. And a new colony of drug-resistant HI virus can form. Pretty self-explanatory, but like, oh, sorry for my spelling, I'm going to correct that now. That's terrible. I will, like I said, choose one and learn one of those examples really well. Whichever one does not matter. Okay, just for your knowledge, you can see there that I've corrected antiretrovirals, because the HI virus is a retrovirus. We did that in DNA. And this is anti-retroviruses, so it fights retroviruses. Okay, comparing Lamarck and Darwin's theories. Now remember, Lamarck is totally wrong. Darwin is almost right, but not quite there yet. So Lamarck, the variation is brought about by individuals changing. So like I said, it's like looking at a classroom of people and be like, oh, some people have their ears pierced in the lobe, some of them have their nose pierced, some of them have their belly button pierced. That's individuals changing themselves. Whereas with Darwin's theories, the individuals are born with variation. So the fact that we are born with different color hair, different color eyes, different style hair, everything like that. For Lamarck, the individuals want to change. So there's an internal drive. So I chose to get my ears pierced. Some people haven't chosen that. There's this internal drive for change. Whereas with Darwin's theory, the environmental factors working randomly lead to changes. So weather patterns, whether there was soot on the trees or no soot on the trees, that's environmental factors. And individuals change because of adapting to the environment. So they will choose to adapt to the environment. Whereas with Darwin, the nature will select those that are best suited to that specific environment, and those ones survive. So like the moths. The white moth survived in the cleaner, non-sooty environment, and the dark moth survived in the sooty environment. That's nature selecting. Like I said again, Lamarck, individuals change, whereas Darwin, the whole population changes. And here again with Lamarck, changes are brought about by adaptation to the environment, are inherited from parent to offspring. But it's more with Darwin. The desired characteristics are passed to enable populations to survive in an environment. It's just looking at what is better for the species' survival. Okay, so like I've said already, Darwin's theory can also be called phyletic gradualism or just gradualism. And what that means is evolution or changes in a species occurs very gradually or slowly and uniformly over long periods of time. Like I said, Darwin's almost correct. He's almost there in terms of his accuracy about his theories. What he has been found to be wrong about or slightly incorrect about is the speed at which these changes take place. So the latest theory is called punctuated equilibrium. And that was proposed by two guys called Aldridge and Gould. You must know the names of those two gentlemen because they are they come up as A only, B only questions, where it says punctuated equilibrium, and then it says A Aldridge, B Gould, and then you must say both A and B. Anyway, so punctuated equilibrium, on the other hand, is when the organisms don't undergo any changes for a very long period of time. That long period of time is called stasis, meaning they are staying the same. That's how I remember stasis. Then, suddenly, the species will undergo rapid change over a short period of geological time. So we're not talking about, humans have been the same for a couple hundred years, looking pretty standard, and then suddenly in 1 year's time, all humans are going to be born with no hair on their head at all. It's in geological time, so it's more like 45 million years can go by where a species doesn't show any changes or major changes, and then over 3 million years, for example, a species will undergo so many changes that it becomes a new species, which is a process that we call speciation. So when a new species forms, we call it speciation. So what we have, if we look at these two pictures, I hope you can see them. Let's maybe do gradualism first. It's important to note that in your textbook, you have these two pictures of the butterflies, and then there are bullet points next to it. But you can see that the bullet points don't really match up to the picture that it's next to. So actually, the top 6 bullet points, the first 6 belong with this picture on the right. So these bullet points belong with that, and these bullet points belong with that. So just make sure, what I've done is I've drawn a curvy bracket showing that actually the bullet, otherwise it gets confusing because you're reading one thing and then you're looking sideways and the image isn't showing what you're reading. So what I've got in my presentation here is correct. So let's look at gradualism because we've looked at this already. So there's butterflies in the picture looking at going from a golden brown butterfly to 2 species, a white and brown and an orange butterfly. So, but the example in words is looking at tigers. So this is Darwinism. Gradualism is Darwinism. At first, the entire population of tiger-like animals were unstriped. A few tigers developed marks, so there is variation. So as a result of mutations. So there is variation in the population of tigers. Some have marks on their fur, others do not. These marks help them camouflage, so more individuals with marks on them survived and reproduced than those without marks. Over a long period of time, more and more individuals with marks survived from generation to generation. At the same time, the marks became gradually clear stripes, and eventually the entire population of tiger-like animals became striped. So with the butterflies, you can see there was this butterfly that was this color. Slowly but surely, you can see this one becoming slightly more orange over millions of years. And then this one became slightly more white over millions of years. And at the end, they're 2 different species. So that's gradualism. Punctuated equilibrium, remember, it's punctuated because it's species times of no change at all. So this shows no change because the x-axis is morphological change. So if it's going straight on the x-axis, there's no change. So straight up means no change. But then it says no change, sudden change there, and then this one doesn't change. No change, sudden change over here, and then that one looks different. So starts off a similar way. A long time ago, there were lots of tiger-like animals, but without stripes. Suddenly, a mutation occurred in a few of the animals, causing a huge change. They were born with stripes. So in gradualism, you looked at the fact that some were born with some marks. Now, suddenly there's a mutation and they were born with stripes. Stripes help the tigers to camouflage amongst the grass and the trees, so more striped tigers survived and reproduced than the unstriped ones. Striped tigers live to reproduce. Okay, fine. They said reproduce. And their striped offspring also did very well, meaning they didn't die. And over a few generations, the whole population was born striped. And like I said, that's Aldridge and Gould. You must know those 2 names. One more thing to note in your textbook is just above the block on page 200. So at the bottom of the page, it says, note that in gradualism, the variation is continuous And then in brackets it says sudden change from no stripes to stripes. That's wrong. What it says in brackets is not a sudden change. Gradualism is actually the next bracketed phrase. Gradual change from no stripes to small stripes to larger stripes. Because then it says there, while in punctuated equilibrium, the variation is discontinuous. And then, yeah, so the brackets in that last paragraph need to be switched around. Just make note of that. So that page is the one page that your textbook does not do so well in. But like I said, punctuated equilibrium is now the more accepted theory of how evolution occurs. That there's suddenly a change that made this butterfly. Suddenly some individuals were born with a mutation that made them orange. And then this one's still alive at the same time as this orange one. But then again, suddenly a change happened to make some of the individuals white. So at the end, you end up with 3 different color butterflies, which would be different species as well. So some of the criticisms: can rapid change over short periods of time? Rapid change occurs, over short periods of time. Remember, we're talking short periods of time as in a million years. It's not 10 minutes. So yes, when natural selection is strong, meaning the environment can change very quickly, then yes, such quick change can occur. And why would species experience long periods of stasis without changing? It's looking at when the environment does not change. If nothing is driving a species to change, if they are perfectly adapted to the environment, then why are they going to change? So, it's when the environment does not change, or changes in the environment oscillate back and forth. Like, for example, with the peppered moth, it was clean trees, dirty trees, clean trees, and it could be dirty trees again one day. And one species that we have seen that is undergoing a long period of stasis is the coelacanth. So just to show you this graph, anytime you see a sideways movement on the graph, it's a change in body form. So that is the same body form in green there. Then it evolved to form a different body in red and a different body in blue. So those are now separate species. But now the blue body form has stayed the same and the red one has stayed the same. So this section where the body form is not changing, it's not moving along on the x-axis, is showing stasis. There's the punctuated part. There's the equilibrium part. Okay, here you can take a 5-minute break and we're going to move on to speciation next. But 5-minute break. You can pause here. Okay, so I was just recording for like 5 minutes and I wasn't recording. So here we go again. The next heading, which is an important part of evolution, is speciation. And what that is the formation of a new species. Meaning, changes occur in a species so much that a couple million years later or down the line, the species that exists now is so different from the old species that it's actually considered a new species. And we look at this with human evolution because there's lots of evidence of it with our human ancestors and how we have evolved from them. So we got 2 causes for speciation. One is allopatric speciation, and that is when the population is separated by a geographical or geographic barrier, such as the sea or a mountain. So something that is a geography thing, and it separates a population suddenly, maybe like a volcanic eruption or something. And we'll look at this allopatric speciation today. Sympatric speciation we'll do in the next lesson, but it's important to note that there is no geographical barrier separating them. It is only a reproductive isolating mechanism, so something that stops these individuals reproducing. Maybe they mate at different times of the year, or their mating calls are different so they don't respond to each other. Okay, but we'll do that in detail in the next lesson. So allopatric speciation, what I put here is an allopatric. And I always say allopatric because I like to think of, I remember this from my matric year, but I like to think that I'm in South Africa and I'm waving at my friend Patrick in Australia and I say, hello, Patrick. I don't know what that accent is, but still. So we are separated by a geographical barrier. In this case, it's the sea or an ocean. So there's always some physical separation that's stopping us from interbreeding. That sounds weird. I don't know someone called Patrick in Australia, just by the way. Anyway, so how allopatric speciation works is you have a population of insects in this case, and there is variation in that population. So there's a beige beetle, there's a brown one, there's a dark brown, like a mud color, there's another gross color brown, whatever. So there is variation in population, always. Now, that population of insects suddenly becomes separated by a geographic barrier. And in this case, it is a river. So you must always tell me what is the barrier. So there's a tick for that a population becomes separated by a geographic barrier. And there's a tick for telling me what the barrier is. It is a river. But don't come here with this example of if I drew a mountain here, and you've now just memorized this picture, and you come and say, a population is separated by a geographic barrier, a river, but in the picture it's a mountain. You must tell me in that specific example, what is the geographic barrier? It's not always a river or a sea or a mountain. You must, and I will tell you in the question, just don't rote learn things. That's what I'm saying. And it happens often, so you can giggle, but it happens. So in this example, it's a river. It's not always a river. And then it gets split into two subpopulations. So just remember, these are all the same species, but they've just been split up. Let's say these insects can't fly, or this river is like 40 kilometers wide, so they can't fly that far, they'll die, whatever. Now, because there's this river between them, there will be no gene flow between the two now new populations, because that's an area of this individuals of the same species, and this is a different area. So these are two new populations, but they're the same species. So there's no gene flow between the subpopulations or the populations, the separated populations, and the environment on each side of the river might be so different that it leads to natural selection happening differently on each side of the river. So maybe this side of the river is sandy and this side of the river is foresty. So on this side of the river, it's beneficial to be brown because you blend in with the sand. But on this side of the river, it's beneficial to be green because you're very well hidden amongst the leaves. And remember, this happens over millions of years, not just summer, like tomorrow, there's suddenly some green insects. So each subpopulation undergoes natural selection independently due to different selective pressures. So like I said, this environment selects for the brown bugs, and this environment selects for the green bugs. So each population becomes genotypically, so genetically, and phenotypically different. That is often 2 marks. So always say they become genotypically and phenotypically different. Now, if that river was removed, let's say it dried up, so now these insects can crawl to that side and these ones can come to this side. Over time, these populations have become so different that even if they were to mix, meaning come into contact with each other, no interbreeding would be able to take place because they are now new species. Now, this population might not be a new species. It's quite similar to the old one, just maybe a lighter color. But this one is very likely a new species. It's completely green. So in the examples of allopathic speciation, it could be that both subpopulations become completely different from the old population, or only one of them becomes completely different. But speciation has occurred in one or both of the populations, and it would normally be quite clear to you in an example whether it was one or both of the populations. So this slide shows you how the points are broken down. So the population is split into 2 groups. I would say they've said in the question a geographical barrier, and tell me what that barrier is. Each group adapts to new environmental factors, or the best way is each group undergoes natural selection independently, so they develop differently. And each group may become genotypically and phenotypically different, which might prevent them from interbreeding even if they do mix. So in terms of the words here, I prefer the words in my previous, like the wording there. This wording will get you all of the marks in a paper. This wording, one thing they don't like when you talk about natural selection is the individual adapts to the new environment. Sometimes they're strict on that because it makes you think that one individual adapts to the environment, but here it's a group adapting. But also things don't choose to adapt. So adapt implies some kind of choice. So I'm just saying be aware of that's why I say undergoes natural selection independently is a better way to say it. Okay, so you guys need to read through these examples of the Galapagos finches and the tortoises and the baobabs and whatnot, and you must know one example. I like the finches and the tortoises, but I'm not going to go through all of them. You can read through them. But there was one species of finch with a variety of beak types that were on the Galapagos Islands, and then the species spread across the islands. So they became unable to mix and interbreed or reproduce because they were on different islands. So they were separated by a geographical barrier. And please, if something is on an island and something is on another island, the geographical barrier is not a mountain. Islands are separated by the sea. I know that sounds silly, but people will say, they didn't tell me what the geographical barrier was, so I just said it was separated by a geographical barrier. No. If it says something is on an island and something's on another island, the barrier is the sea. Okay, we've got that clear. So, on the different islands, there were different climatic conditions. So that's going to be our environmental pressure. So they change from year to year, drastically influencing the food supply. The food supply on each island did not change in the same way. So some islands, seeds became abundant. Now, if you've got this piccaninny beak, like this tiny thing, try cracking a seed with that. You're going to starve. So finches with seeds beaks like these guys, they happen to be better adapted to their island by dumb luck. There were seeds there and they had a beak that could crack seeds. So the finches that did not have a nice seed beak will die because they are not adapted for that food source. So natural selection occurred independently because maybe on another island insects were the better food source and this one will live and this one's beak is too clunky to catch insects. Yeah. So in the end, there are 13 different types of finches, and some live on the ground eating seeds, some live in cactuses and eat seeds, and some live in trees and eat seeds, and some even eat insects. So in the end, all of these 13 types of finches are unable to interbreed, even though they do mix, and each type is a new species. So yes, they're all finches, but they are all different species of finches. With the tortoises, I'm just going to explain to you the two types of variation because you have your saddleback and your large dome tortoises. So saddleback is a flatter back like a horse's saddle. This dome is huge. Now these tortoises are giant. They're absolutely ginormous. But yeah, you got these tortoises on different islands, and again there was different food source on the island, and some developed dome-shaped shells and other developed saddleback shells. So the large dome tortoises are found on the highlands where there's plenty of food to support their great size. So these guys, they're huge. That requires a lot of food to power all of this. Whereas the saddleback tortoises live on the lower, drier islands where food is scarcer, so a smaller body is advantageous. And this opening of their shell allows their necks to come out much higher. Here the opening of their shell is much lower. Their neck can't lift so high. So that allows them to raise their neck higher to reach sparse vegetation. They also have, you can see here, this leg is folded, so it's much longer legs than the dome-shaped tortoises. So again, there's the geographical barrier, which is the sea. The proteas and the baobabs, that's again separated by the sea because it's looking at proteas in South Africa and Australia. Sea is the geographic barrier, and the baobabs are in Mozambique Madagascar and Africa. So again, sea is the geographic barrier. Okay, so that's speciation. Remember, you always look at, that's allopatric speciation. You always look at what is the geographic barrier. The population is prevented from interbreeding. There's no gene flow. That's the same thing. Then depending on the environment, each population will undergo natural selection independently. And each population becomes genotypically and phenotypically different over millions of years. And then if they do mix, they are prevented from interbreeding because they are different species now. If they could still interbreed and produce fertile offspring, then they're the same species. They had the same environment on both sides of the island, so on both sides of the river. So no speciation occurred. But they wouldn't give you an example like that when the question is on speciation. So what you guys are going to do now, you are going to, at this worksheet, please, got questions, define a population, like I said, important definition in the first lesson, cause of variation, and then here, A and B are two separate species. So there's species A, that's the same as species A. You can see the way they've represented it with squirrels. So that's exactly the same as species A, and there's species B. So now they're two separate species. Describe what can be done to confirm. So there we go. It's again on speciation. So you're going to do that question. This question, question 4, which was an essay question, I would say that's why it's best to understand that Galapagos finches and the tortoises, they're the most common examples because they're what Darwin based his observations on. So I would know those 2 examples because here it was an essay question. There's a multiple choice question. Just check out and skip one. And then there's also this one on a red-bellied snake and a green tree snake. And it also brings a little bit about Darwinism, Lamarckism into here. How would Lamarck explain the development of small jaw size? That's going to be your disuse. You guys are going to do those activities for the rest of this lesson. And that is it.